I'd like to remind you to turn your phones off. I've got 2, so I'm going to have to do it twice. Yeah, okay. And there's no signal in here, so it'll hardly matter. Okay, we do have quorum, so we're going to call the meeting to order. I'm going to advise those in the public gallery that they're welcome to use mobile devices as long as they are in airplane mode and that all devices are muted. It's not permitted to take photographs or record any part of the meeting. Are there any apologies to record, Clerk? Anya Murphy. And no one joining via Zoom today. Everybody else is here. Good. Okay, agenda item 2, declarations of interest. I would remind you of your responsibility to declare any interest in any of the items under discussion today. Does any member have any interest to declare in relation to any of today's agenda items?
Chair, as declared at the previous meeting, I'm the executor of a small holding in County Tyrone with possible future interest.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anything else?
I declare an interest in a partner in the farm business.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Agenda item 3, Chairperson's Business. Item 1, I refer to page 6 of the pack of the invitation from the Right Honourable Alastair MP, Chair of the House of Commons Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee, to an online meeting between committee chairs and conveners to discuss inter-legislature engagement. This meeting is now scheduled for the 10 a.m. on Friday the 16th of May. Members, myself and possibly Declan will attend the online meeting, and a note will be issued by the AFBI committee staff. Agenda item 4. Members, I refer you to pages 8 to 21 of the pack for the draft minutes dated the 20th of March. Have you any comments? Are you content with the minutes as drafted? And if you are, I will sign these and then they will be published on the website. Okay, thank you, members. Agenda item 5 is matters arising. Item 1, I refer you to correspondence from the Department dated 20th of March, pages 23 to 30 of the pack regarding amendments to the UK Employment Rights Bill. You will recall the departmental briefing on the 20th of February on this UK-wide bill which will abolish the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority, otherwise known as GLAA, and move its enforcement powers under the Secretary of State for Business and Trade. It also creates a UK-wide Fair Work Agency which will carry out work for the GLAA going forward. Members, we agreed to support the LCM which the Department for Communities, DFC, is leading on, and which DAERA, Department of Finance and DFE are also within scope. However, the Minister sought an amendment in the original Schedule 4, now Schedule 7 of the bill, due to concern that it did not contain any provision to require approval from the Northern Ireland Executive if the Secretary of State should choose to exercise the power to amend relevant labour market legislation. The requested amendment has now been included and states that consent must be obtained from the relevant Northern Ireland Department when dealing with the transferred matter. Members, further amendments to the bill as a consequence of the House of Commons report stage are set out at Annex A of the correspondence. The Department is now satisfied with the LCM as currently drafted. Have any members any comments that they'd like to make on that? Are you content to note? Thank you, members. Item 2, I refer you to response from the Department dated the 21st of March, pages 31 to 33 of the pack regarding the ASR, the Farm Sustainability Transitional Provisions Regulations Northern Ireland 2025. Members, we wrote to the Department requesting further information on how and why these regulations provide for the movement of funds between schemes. Members, the response states that the regulation includes powers to move funds between relevant schemes in Article 13, introduce changes in policies to enable continued rollout of the Sustainable Agriculture Programme, removes the reference to the total ceiling for Northern Ireland from EU Regulations 1307/2013. This allows DAERA to determine the budget for each scheme year prior to the commencement of payments. Members, the response also states that the regulations provide DAERA with the power to make additional payments if required to farm businesses that are eligible for the basic payment scheme, the Farm Sustainability Transition Payment, or the Farm Sustainability Payment in a scheme year. The Department believes this provides flexibility to direct funding to other areas of the Sustainable Agriculture Programme and ensures that farm businesses benefit from the full agricultural support budget. Have members any points they want to make on that? Are they content? Okay, content.
Chair, still raising concern for the basic payment scheme, that money could be shifted away from that into other areas, which could affect that particular scheme, and it does raise questions. I'm not right sure. I see what has been recorded in Hansard, or what's supposed to be recorded in Hansard. I'm just not sure that it was made clear to the committee that this power was, that this change was actually coming. There is something here certainly, but I'm not sure just that it was made fully clear at committee that that's the actual change that was coming, and it does raise concern with regards to the basic payment scheme.
But yes, I do detect there is a nervousness that there's not the reassurance, perhaps, in industry that the money will stay within the schemes that have been earmarked. Although in that in that communication, I would suggest it's worth reading over again to the committee, because there's nothing in that correspondence to indicate that it isn't going to be, but I'm not sure it ties it down tight enough either.
Yep.
Is that fair? Do members want to seek any further assurance on that in regard to that, or are you content to note and come back to it? Content to note it and come back to it? I would flag it up as something of concern to be aware of at the moment. Okay, members? Let's see what we can say. Okay. Item 3, refer you to the response from the Department dated 24th of March at pages 3 to 6 of the table papers regarding SR 2025-41, the Suckler Cow Scheme Regulations, Northern Ireland 2025. We requested clarity in relation to the percentage of calving events across the year. The Department has provided a table of the average suckler cow calving events recorded in 2022-2023. It shows that 20% of calving events occur in January to March. Peak calving then follows in April, May and June, with 49% of calving events, and then 31% of calving events occur in July and December. I do remember, Rosemary, in that answering a few questions in regard to it. Anyone, any comments in regard to that correspondence, or are you content to note? Content to note. Thank you, members. Item number 4, refer you to pages 6 to 11 of the table papers to the response from the Department dated the 24th of March and follow up to the briefing on the Loch May Action Plan on the 6th of March. We requested details on the projects and actions that are to be funded under the £4.3 million resource DEL and the £12.8 million capital DEL allocations. Members, £2.6 million of the resource DEL will be allocated to actions including an additional enforcement team to focus on key hotspots, enhanced monitoring, support for measures to improve water quality, focused investigations to prevent pollution, and enhanced communication to farmers, landowners and stakeholders. My hope is that would include NI Water. Members, out of the remaining resource DEL allocation, £1.3 million is for water quality, strategic policy development to tackle blue-green algae and to increase monitoring, and £0.4 million for the delivery of innovation labs, communication and knowledge transfer. In relation to the £12.8 million capital DEL, the Department has provided a table of areas proposed allocations. This includes £3.5 million for digital transformation, £5.5 million for sustainable use of livestock slurry, otherwise known as SULs, and £1.2 million for sustainable catchment projects, SCP. We also requested further detail on Phase 2 of the SULS Small Business Research Initiative Programme. The response states that Phase 2 is building on the innovative concepts from Phase 1, including the development of bespoke slurry separation equipment and additives which can lock methane in slurry and allow it to be released later in an AD plant to produce biomethane. Due to commercial confidentiality, DAERA can only provide a high-level overview at this stage. Members, what's that, sorry? Hey, yeah, I know. Mixing up my highs and my highs. October 2024, Phase 2 contracts launched with a combined value of £8 million. It's anticipated that the third contract will be signed shortly, and to date, 3 new jobs have been directly created. Benefits to farmers include ease of use of low-level emission slurry spreading equipment, LESSE, and less slurry fibre, improving both nutrient uptake and silage quality. Members, regarding the iLab and PhD funding allocations, the Loch Ness Strategic Insight Lab was held this month to consider the 20 to 30-year vision for Loch Ness, and an update on this will be provided in due course. In relation to the ongoing 2025 postgraduate competition, 23 applications were received for 12 PhD awards, and interviews will be held from the 14th to the 16th of April. Have members any matters that they would like to raise in regard to that, or are you content to note? Content to note. Okay, guys. Thank you for that. Okay, now we're on agenda item 6, which is the Agricultural Bill and Committee Deliberations. Members, as you will recall, last week we continued our deliberations on Clause 2 through to Clause 6, and Committee requested that those who responded to the call for evidence should be invited to submit an update, given the Minister's assurance regarding the current scheme not closing in December. NIMGA and the motion producers have confirmed that they wish to brief us again, and this is being arranged for next week. Members, I again welcome the officials, John Terrington and Elaine McCrory, to answer questions and to discuss as we go along. Members, just to remind us all, the aim of the deliberations is to go through the bill one clause at a time, discuss any issues or queries in respect of the clauses from the evidence we have received, identify whether there are any further information or clarification that may be required, and to decide on whether any amendments are to be considered, and if we do propose any amendment, to be as precise as possible on what we want the amendment to achieve, and to clarify with the Department that this is something that the Minister would be happy to undertake. So therefore, members, I draw your attention to page 38 of the pack to the updated legal advice from the Examiner of Statutory Rules, which includes a small correction to the report which she highlighted during her closed session presentation last week. I also refer you to page 51 of the pack to the response from the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, stating that they have no comments to make on this bill. Members, you have been provided with papers for this item starting on page 30 of the pack, including a copy of the bill and a copy of the explanatory memorandum. The clerk updated our deliberations table after last week's meeting, which can be found at page 52 to 61 of the pack. The table summarises where we got to in terms of queries and comments by the end of last week's session. The information in blue text in that table is from the ESR report and remains restricted legal advice. The evidence summary table starts at page 158, followed by all the written evidence received, either by Citizen Space or accompanying the oral briefings. If anybody needs to find any of those, we can certainly direct you to them. If members are content, then we will make a start, and I welcome to the meeting the officials John Terrington and Elaine McCrory. And John and Elaine, we were down a few members last week, as you will remember. I think if you don't mind, can we start at the beginning? And it's not to interrogate you desperately hard on this, but it is to ensure that all members have had a fair chance to go over the clause by clause. So I'll ask you to give a very brief overview, if that's okay, in regard to each clause as they come up, and then quickly maybe highlight any specific issues. You can address anything maybe in terms of queries that have been raised, so that we're not going over the same queries and questions for you time and again. So if you would like to kick off with clause 1.
Starting at clause
1.
1 again?
Yes, please.
Sure. Thank you. Clause 1, there are 6 clauses. Clause 1 makes support under the Legacy EU Fruit and Vegetable Aid Scheme discretionary. That is, it removes an obligation automatically to fund all eligible claims, and doing so brings it in line with other agriculture support. Makes this change by amending Article 32 of the Assimilated CMO Regulation 1308 of 2013, enables the Department to continue the Fruit and Veg Aid Scheme purely on a discretionary basis in Northern Ireland. A new Article 1A is inserted into the CMO by subsection 4 of the clause of clause 1 of the bill. This is required to clarify who is eligible for discretionary support, a PO or an association of POs, but other maintains the status quo in that regard. There aren't any APOs in Northern Ireland anyway. Finally, Clause 1 contains transitional provisions in relation to existing FEAS programmes. It's a belt and braces provision to ensure that nothing in the bill impacts on existing agreed operational programmes, which are due to end at the end of this year. Clause 2, this is where we find the powers for the Department to make regulations to modify the named direct fruit and veg aid scheme legislation. It also includes an additional power to make more specific regulations regarding the review of decisions relating to support under the scheme. This is important because the support no longer being mandatory. Regulations made under the power would provide for appeal of decisions and would be in line with rules already in place for other support. Moving very briefly to Clause 3, this clause also confirms the power of the Department to make regulations on assimilated law, this time in relation to the EU Agri-Food Information and Promotion Schemes. And last week Elaine did give a short summary of that. If you want to do that again, we'll do that perhaps at the end before we move on, because it isn't an area we have discussed an awful lot at committee. Clause 4 provides some details around the regulating making powers in clauses 2 and 3. It provides these regulations can make supplementary, incidental, consequential, transitional, transitory or saving provisions, which we believe is a standard provision to allow for changes to other legislation to ensure a fully functioning statute book following amendments made by the assimilated law in clauses 2 or clauses 3. Particularly important given the complex and interwoven nature of EU law. And indeed, as Elaine pointed out last week, the powers in the Agri-Food Information Scheme refer to the Fruit and Veg Aid Scheme or vice versa, showing some idea of the complications involved, potentially. Subsection 2 of Clause 4 also provides that consequential, etc. changes can be made to any statutory provision, which when read in conjunction with the Interpretation Act, as set out in Clause 5, can include primary legislation. This again is a narrow power and it's a standard to ensure a fully functioning statute book. Finally, in this clause provides that any regulations under the bill can only be made following by approval of the Assembly, that is to say, draft affirmative resolution. Clause 5 provides interpretation of terms used in the bill, including to modify, which would include amend, appeal or revoke. These, again, are standard provisions allowing for changes in whole or in part to the legislation in question, and important to have these should an alternative scheme be developed where it would be considered inappropriate to maintain any old legislation on the statute book. The clause also defines statute provision, as I've already mentioned. Finally, Clause 6, another technical clause providing for the coming into operation of the Act on royal assent, which, given the transitional provision in Clause 1, will have impact on any existing operational programmes and the current support for them. The clause also sets out the Act's short title, the Agricultural Act Northern Ireland. Hopefully this has helped you refresh your memories as to the details in the 6 clauses.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your attendance to this point, and hopefully we'll get through a good bit of it today again. If you don't mind, we'll just go back clause by clause, members, and take them in order, 1 through to 6. And I think we know where most of the discussions are going to be. I have a number of queries, if I could just go through them, about 4, if that's okay. So the first one, and we do, and I know this has been probably alluded to in plenary, that members on the committee are appreciative of the move by the Minister not to close the FEAS at the end of the year. But a question I'd like to, if you have the answer, is the Minister's intention to guarantee 3 years of funding for successful applicants, or is the funding open until such times as a new scheme is developed? Or which comes sooner?
At this stage, I think the Minister was always clear, really, that he wasn't going to remove support without suitable alternative support being there. So obviously he wanted to make that reassurance clearer. As it stands, PO submitted a 3-year operational programme. So I think what we're planning to do is to get those 3-year operational programmes running, and in tandem with that, design with the sector suitable alternative support. So I think we can't say categorically that it's only going to be the 3 years, nor can we categorically say it's going to run on forever. It depends on the timescale of developing this alternative.
That's okay. So the query in this regard, to be fair, is the context of the 3 years. So the 3-year plan will obviously require 3 years of support and funding. And the query I'm asking is if the new scheme is developed inside those 3 years, does that then end the support? So say someone makes application for a new scheme inside those 3 years, for instance, does that then knock out the 3-year, or will that 3-year programme of funding run the whole way through?
I think it's too early to tell that,
okay.
Because obviously we're quite early in designing the new scheme, whatever that may be. If it's, I think John said this before, the powers we have at the moment are to develop, or to amend, or would be to amend the existing FEAS. Mm-hmm. So that's what we have. We don't have a great deal of separate domestic legislation to help us run an alternative scheme. The Agriculture Act 49 Act is there, and it's being used for some of the sustainable agriculture programmes at the moment. So I think we need to get this work started and see where it takes us. We obviously need to keep engaging with the sector on it, because they need to know what's happening. They need to be part of that co-design process. So I think we would work with them to see where we're going with this. Again, if the bill was enacted, there are transitional powers in there too, so we could make adjustments to extend a programme maybe for another year if the new support wasn't ready. But it's quite hard to tell at this stage exactly what would happen. I think the certainty is the legislation says you apply for a 3-year programme. And another factor to consider as well, this is a match-funded 3-year programme. It's subject to what the POs want to do. So they will determine the course of action they want to do. They come to the department to approve the programme, and then the money is released as they undertake. certain activities.
So, and then I suppose the easy one for me to understand here, but maybe get the answer from is if someone is successful in terms of their 3-year bid and it's match funded and they do that, but a new scheme is developed, but they don't either meet the criteria or don't apply for it, will the department stand over the 3 years that 3-year delivery?
If they're in the middle of that 3-year programme,
yeah,
my assumption would be yes,
okay,
because they've made the commitment to fund a 3-year programme.
That's okay. Okay, that's kind of, thank you for that one. Does anybody want to come in on that one? Could I afford to get through on that piece there, Declan? Or
no, it just was with that Henry VIII powers. If that's maybe not the time to mention it, is it?
Actually, we'll come into that if that's all right. Yeah. Okay. So the second question is: would I be correct in understanding that Clause 1, Section 4, refers to amending only the current assimilated law relating to the FEAS to provide that financial assistance that may be granted to POs? So that any new FEAS may require new primary law or regulations?
I mean, I guess it depends on what is meant by a new fruit and veg aid scheme. There might, let's wipe the slate clean and come up with something brand new called the vegetable and fruit scheme, which is entirely different. Mm-hmm. We would certainly be constrained in these powers to do that. You know, almost create something brand new, as Elaine said. But the powers are there, I'm saying, and I've made the point a couple of times. You know, if you, it's all very technical, but if you look and see what is there already in the scheme, it would be powers to change that, and that would be the limitations. But they're still quite broad and does cover many of the things that the sector had called for during the consultation and in parallel the review. But if it's a completely brand new scheme that you know, if it felt that something could be put in place that assisted the particular sector that has made use of the fruit and veg scheme, but was more attractive to other sectors. That's
probably what this relates to. It's that.
I mean, there's no reason why the fruit and veg scheme shouldn't. But well, there are reasons that people have not taken part, at least in Northern Ireland, and there may be things that could be amended using these powers that would make it more attractive to other sectors. But if the idea was that this needed a scheme needed to make it more attractive, and the fruit and veg scheme was never going to do that. Something new was needed. The theory is that may need new powers in the future to do that.
Okay, yeah.
My assumption would be that the fruit and veg scheme would run on until such times as is, or perhaps that's amended to make it more Northern Ireland friendly, to meet outcomes review, to meet some of the stakeholder requirements, or whatever else might do as part of that stage of the policy development.
No problem. Patsy, just before bringing in, is it in relation to this?
Yeah, it's this particular topic.
Make sure we keep it in. That's okay.
Oh no, I get that. Yeah. Just on that, when I'm looking at the response here by officials about fruit and vegetable scheme, and scheme is available to other sectors but not used. Fruit and vegetable FEAS review is looking at why uptake is not wider. If you're conducting a review, what are the initial findings of that review? Because if you have a scheme that's not been used, obviously it's not attractive or it's not useful to presume that the horticulturist people would know of the existence of the scheme. And if they're not using it, that means it's no use to them. So are you getting any initial soundings from them as to why it's no use to them?
And then I'll take on the review, but I say first, I mean, it clearly is of use to the mushroom sector, and that they've made good use of it, and hence the commitment to continue to support them.
Yes.
In terms of the review, I don't think it would be secret that.
I think some of the things from the review are fairly obvious. Okay, we haven't concluded finally yet, but there's some things that are obvious. The mushroom sector thinks this is, I think it was quoted as a fantastic scheme at one stage, is what they said to us. But they think it could be improved. Yeah. The mushrooms think that. The strawberry people were part of a PO before, but did not like the constraints of being in a PO. So you have to be in a producer organisation currently to avail of this aid.
Right.
And they didn't like being in a PO because they felt they'd lost a bit of control They had to market everything through the PO, and they didn't want to do that. They wanted to have keep their own customers. So there are things like that the strawberry people didn't like. There are others, we've spoken to the UFU about this, and some of the field crop people just don't think it's appropriate for them. Again, they have issues around being in a PO. Mm-hmm. And I think that's mostly what's driving this rather than fruit and veg aid, and they prefer, they also prefer competitive funding because it's a very competitive sector.
And have the mushroom growers expressed, those that are within a PO, have they expressed similar concerns?
About being in a PO or
about being in a PO?
Well, about being in a PO, there's always tensions within a PO. You have people working together. There's always tensions working together. And, you have to democratically agree what the organisation is going to do, who's going to get funding in a particular year and who's not. So there's always a bit of tension in there, but the mushroom sector has made it work for them. Okay, we've got 3 POs, people in 3 POs, they're not in 1 PO. Again, that maybe tells you about some of the tensions there can be. People have different ideas about what they want to do. So, on the whole, they're happy with being in a PO, I would say. You can ask them yourselves next week, but I think the mushroom sector are happy. The fruit and veg aid scheme, they think there are things that could be improved. I think it's a great scheme. It gives them stability and certainty, but there are things they would like to see improved in it. So they're looking across the border and they're saying that in South of Ireland you can get 80% funding for certain things. They can only get 50 here. So there's things that they would like to see changed within the existing scheme. And we cannot do those at the moment because we don't have the power to do it.
Power and the money. Have you got the money to do it?
Well, we have put forward bids for the money. There's the ring-fenced budget. As it stands, we have some money. If it shoots up big time, the budget, then maybe we won't have the money to do it. And if it does increase, then the Minister is making decisions about, well, do I take money from somewhere else to fund this? Because he's got a finite envelope of money.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Patsy, only seconds before this. Is there? I'm just going to then open it out now to members in terms of clause 1 for any further questions or queries in regard to that, guys, or clarification even for maybe those that maybe didn't get in a full go at last week's session. The paper that the clerk and the team have put together is pretty substantive because it does really encapsulate all of our questions and queries so far. And if members are content, looking around the room, just we'll move on to clause 2. Yep. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. I do have a query on clause 2, if that's okay. So am I correct in understanding that clause 2 refers to regulations to modify pertaining to the existing assimilated laws on the FEAS so that it will be possible to improve the existing scheme while the development of a new scheme is underway? That's fair enough.
That is. Well, I mean, there are issues of timing to do that for the next operational programme until we have those powers. But that is the aim of taking them to do that to improve. And we've said before, whether that's to align with the ROI, whether it's to align with something else that maybe is in the comes out of the review.
A wider policy.
And most of those you will have heard from the stakeholders anyway, the things that they would want to see improved, and they are mostly about alignment, or whether they're to make the thing a little bit more less bureaucratic, perhaps, as an EU scheme, and align with financial practices in the department or whatever. But all would be seen as improvements. And
in that one, is I'm not sure it's deliberately so, but obviously the mushroom sector is quite significant, not just in terms because the avail of the scheme, but the very fact of their output in terms of that. The horticultural, they're a real pillar in the horticultural output for Northern Ireland. So we've indicated that the strawberry sector is one, but there's also, I think we've discussed this before, but would this then deliberately offer the flexibility to improve it for broadening the scheme to other sectors beyond strawberries and mushrooms, tomatoes and so on? Is that the kind of
that may be possible. There may be other bits of their some of their main concerns about being a member of a producer organisation, which are separate but very interrelated rules, but they're primarily for DAERA. And our powers, the powers that we would have to change those 3 pieces of legislation wouldn't extend to moving into reserved areas, as you'd understand. So there may be some things that could be done to facilitate other sectors' involvement. There may be stuff that's outside of our because they're reserved matters. Or
maybe it's about promoting it to the other sectors a bit more as well. I think the POs have mentioned this before, that they didn't feel the scheme had been promoted particularly well because it was an EU scheme. So maybe that's something that could be looked at as well. I mean, again, I can't preempt the outcome of the review and what the Minister wants to do, but these are things that we can consider. You know, is it a lack of awareness about the scheme?
Yeah.
I mean, and to be fair to other comments that have been made by the mushroom sector about the CAFRE offer for horticultural support, that they said that didn't suit them. A lot of that is trying to address an issue that has been identified about why people have been part of BOs might be because of a slight resistance to collaboration, and those other schemes are looking to try and facilitate that sort of collaboration, which might have them stepping over the problems that they have, and then look to be PO membership might be an out from that, or the next step from that.
I know that this legislation doesn't necessarily do it, but I do see the collaborative approach being paying off in terms of the scale of marketability or sellability and stuff. Has there been any internal work on how something to like alternative to POs in terms of that collaboration for a single item producer?
Again, that's there's a number of parallel streams going on in terms of looking at that for the Hort scheme. I mean, that was the department identified a gap where most sectors don't collaborate particularly well for whatever reason, and that's really what those schemes are set up to do. The realisation and the acceptance that wasn't going to help the mushroom sector is why we're where we are with the Minister making his commitment for the next 3 years. I expect there's other work going on looking at supply chain and collaboration.
And it wouldn't be as far advanced as some of the other elements. I think Rosemary mentioned that too before. As part of the Sustainable Agriculture Programme, there is this supply chain work stream that is looking at interventions to try and make it a more efficient, joined-up supply chain. Not just in terms of horizontal collaboration, but in vertical collaboration too, because we're not always good at getting all elements of the kitchen to work together, and there is a reluctance to do that.
Yeah. Okay. I have just one more, members, if that's okay, in regard to this clause 2. Regarding the term "modify" it, obviously it pops up a couple of times, which is defined as amend, repeal, and revoke. Can I ask, is the only circumstance that repeal and revoke would be used is to repeal or revoke the current assimilated law once a new scheme has been agreed, or is there anything beyond that circumstance where repeal or revoke could be used?
My understanding is that the power be used to revoke parts of or bits of, and we have a number of provisions, I suspect, in the EU laws, or the legacy EU laws that stands, that are not relevant to Northern Ireland. They were about EU or membership of the EU. So there is, I believe, the opportunity to revoke.
There's some bits left in the assimilated law that are redundant.
So that would be one issue when it could be done, and one of the reasons for the power being a general power would be to tidy up things like that. But ultimately, I mean, I did say in my introduction to it that it would provide for the removal of all or any of this should there be a replacement, rather than having it on the statute books. But it has other suboptimal or uses below that or before that.
It also relate to the information and promotions that clause. Am I right in saying it's that those modify powers apply to the information and promotions as well? There are bits of that we might change, or we might decide going forward that legislation is no longer required.
No problem. And again, all the regulations on the bill are made under approval of the Assembly, so there's the chance for debate.
Yeah, I mean, and ultimately that is the we think for a number of reasons, a number of aspects of the bill, that part is a safety net for the.
Yes, but that I need to, kind of myself just need to come back to each time too. So okay, thank you. Have any of the other members anything on clause 2 in particular that they want to see clarified or seek further information? Okay. Okay, clause 3 then, members. I don't have any further questions in regard to clause 3 myself. I just will reiterate a couple of points in regard to that. The majority of response report to clause 3, that was because some thought that more information was needed, as modifying the scheme could potentially reduce current levels of funding. The review of the current scheme needs to be completed and a clear plan laid out for the future of the funding. And the key risk to small farmers, including reduced access to promotional support, favouritism towards large agribusiness, potential loss of transparency and information sharing. Some of that's already been alluded to, and these responses did come in prior to the ministerial announcement of the extension of the funding granted. So I don't have any further questions or need clarification in clause 3. Does anybody else have anything that they need to get more information on? Nope. Okay. Clause 4 then. Yep. Okay. So I know I do have an indication for the floor, particularly around the Henry VIII bars, which will relate in terms of start to kick in about clause 4. So I don't have any further questions or queries on that, but I'm going to bring Declan in then to seek clarification on his points.
Yeah, sometimes you need to be a lawyer to try to get your head around some of these matters. It's just in relation to that Henry VIII powers. Now, from my reading and understanding of it, this is the ability to amend primary legislation using delegated legislation. And but delegated legislation would be subjected to a lesser degree of scrutiny. So what's your interpretation of that there? Why is the Henry VIII power needed in this situation?
If I may, you're right, by the interwoven nature of the clauses and the definitions therein, the powers in both clause 2 and 3 would allow for the amendment of primary legislation, and therefore, on the face of it, it could be considered an Henry VIII power. However, I'll start with its draft affirmative.
Yeah.
So there still is I don't see supporting legislation to me is important as primary legislation, and the Assembly processes are same, and that is a vote of the Assembly. So that's again,
it's going to the Assembly anyway.
Yes, so that is a safety net at the end of the process.
Yeah.
But at the start of the process, the powers, as I said, at clause 2, and would reiterate with clause 3, are broad in the sense that they are enabling, and the committee can't see on the face of the bill what it enables to do.
Yeah.
But to look at the fruit and veg aid scheme legislation or the information and promotion legislation, you will see that sets out the limits of what we could change. So the power under clause 2, just to take one at a time, the same things apply to both, are narrow in that it only allows to change those 3 pieces of legislation insofar as the bits that are delegated or not reserved. So that's a narrow change already. The change in terms of the definition to allow for consequential, transitional, etc., is a very narrow change, and is related only to any changes that are caused by the changes made for policy reasons to the CMO and the 2 delegated implementing acts. So they are consequential on policy changes. They themselves are not policy changes. They are to allow that the policy changes don't adversely affect other legislation elsewhere, including subordinate legislation. And I've already said, for example, the 2 bits of legislation, the two schemes are having interrelation in there in terms of POs can apply for information funding to get to, be part of that scheme. But there are lots of other places around the EU law where there might be definitions that we want to make sure that you haven't made a change to the legislation that's listed in the bill and had an adverse effect somewhere else. So it's narrow in that it's only the fruit and veg aid scheme. It's narrow only that it's only consequential on those changes, and that extends to if there happened to be any primary legislation that was amended. It is it's consequential. It's not a policy position. That doesn't change anything in the policy itself. It isn't a major change, and therefore it's not deemed as a Henry VIII power in the sense that that is meant. And it would be made by draft affirmative anyway. Should there be any concerns? I hope that gives some reassurance. It is a standard power to be drafted, in that if you're making legislation that would allow amendments to the places, that you make sure you can amend anywhere and not end up with something that just doesn't work somewhere because of an incorrect definition or the use of a term that no longer exists, or the kind of things that come to mind when I've seen it used before.
Yeah, so if we called it the vegetable and fruit scheme or something like that instead, I know that's facetious, but if we did that, we'd have to make sure that followed through in any other related legislation. Or if we said you can't have funding, you can't have double funding for this and that, and the two names are wrong, it won't work. The legislation won't work properly, so you need to be sure that the naming conventions, the definitions, all those things follow through naturally.
It is very far down the line of a process where the policy is decided, you bring forward your drafting of the subordinate legislation to say we want to change the fruit and veg aid scheme rules thus, and then you would have to do a sweep of all other legislation to make sure that doesn't have any unseen or unwarranted consequences within subordinate legislation, including retained or assimilated EU law, or potentially, and it is potentially. And sitting here, I'm not sure that I could identify any, but again, it would depend on the legislation.
It's probably going to be
the other bits of retained law,
the assimilated law,
because
EU law is very interconnected.
But it is
so that things will run through various different pieces of legislation, and you need to make sure that they're all consistent with each other.
But I wouldn't be surprised when the committee comes to look at other primary legislation that they don't see similar provision as that. It's that just in case somewhere down the line you don't end up with a statute book that doesn't operate in some way.
That's fine. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, John.
Forgive me if I've asked this before, but without Henry VIII powers, there would be no power to amend primary legislation. Or is it another route?
It's sitting here. Well, I mean, we already said that there aren't powers to change the CMO. That's why we need this. If something came up, I guess it would be something you'd go and try and find. Is there another route to do this? Is there another? Could you supplement some other piece of primary legislation down the road and make the change? But you know, there isn't an obvious place, and as I say, it would be the time to do it is to do it while using, if the department gets them, these enabling powers, so that you're making sure the day and hour those subordinate legislation comes into place and those changes are made to the fruit and veg scheme or the information promotion schemes, that everything else works at that point. I can't say categorically that send a lawyer into a corner, they can't find some way of doing it. But it would likely to be using some of the other primary powers to change primary. This is the only way that you could use subordinate legislation, because it's consequential on those powers or transitional on those powers, etc. I
do remember in the last mandate where a piece of legislation was coming through where the sponsor was looking to exercise Henry VIII powers with a negative resolution, which didn't happen. Then the trade-off was that was conferring too much power to the department.
I mean, I take upon and say that these are so narrow that I wouldn't be overly worried about them being negative resolution, but given that the rest of it is based on then that safety net is there for all the powers in the bill, and I'd set out in the delegated powers memorandum in order both to give the Assembly its place, but also it parallels how the powers we have to change the other Common Agricultural Policy legislation through the Agricultural Act 2020, where all those powers are draft affirmative. So it was important to for whatever reason, to make sure that that aligned, so that there was consistency and continuity along those lines.
Okay, cool. Happy enough. Anything else on clause 4? Nope. Okay. Clause 5, guys, that is interpretation aspect of it. I don't have any queries in regard to that. We have a couple of items on our paper that we've put through. If any other members, any further items of clarification to seek on clause 5? No? Okay, thank you very much for that. We move on to clause 6, which is the commencement and the short title. I'm not going to assume anything. I'm just going to put the question to you guys. If anybody any point of clarification or information that they require?
Nope.
No? Okay, members. Okay, members, I just want to thank you both for attending again, and obviously we reserve the right to ask you to attend again if the committee needs that to be the case. We may not, but we will be hearing from some of the stakeholders in the next couple of weeks, and hopefully the committee will then be in a position then to finalise our position on the bill. So on behalf of the committee, I just want to thank you for your attendance and wish you a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Okay. Yep. Members, I propose we now move on to the next agenda item and return to the deliberations next week, when we will also do a closed session with our Assembly Bill official as we start to make some decisions in regard to that piece of draft legislation. Members, I now request your agreement to move ahead to agenda item 8, which is a departmental written briefing on the SI, the Fair Dealing Obligations Pig Regulations 2025. Members, Elaine leads on this item and has offered to respond to any queries members may have on the written briefing. Are members agreed?
Yep.
I feel like Keith Lemon doing this here. Thank you, Elaine. Members, I refer you to pages 224 to 225 of the pack, the clerk's memo, which provides a summary of the written briefing, and to pages 226 to 231 of the pack for this item. A copy of the draft SIN explanatory memorandum is at page 232 to 253 of the pack. Members, as we noted at our meeting last week, the draft SI, the Fair Dealing Obligation Pig Regulations 2025, was led in Westminster on the 13th of March and extends to Northern Ireland. The purpose of the regulation is to improve fairness in the UK pig sector and will introduce mandatory written contracts between first purchasers and pig sellers for all pigs sold in the UK unless the seller opts out of having a written contract. This will apply to all new contracts from summer 2025 and existing contracts from summer 2026. The regulation also makes an amendment to the previous Fair Dealing Obligation Milk Regulations 2024 in relation to tiered pricing in exclusive milk contracts, which will come into force when the SI is made. Elaine, do you want to... No, happy
I wasn't going to do a presentation,
No.
but I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, we're fine.
Just doing questions.
Okay, members.
Unless there's something in particular
No, it's okay.
you want me to.
Right, okay. I'll pop it open here. And Declan is out at the moment, so have members any queries or questions they want to raise in terms of the written briefing at this stage? Okay, can I ask then, in terms of, has there been any assessment of the impact, either good or bad, for pig producers in Northern Ireland?
Well, there was a de minimis assessment done in terms of the costs. So DAERA did a de minimis assessment. The overall costs for the UK are less than £5 million, and therefore it hasn't been a full regulatory impact assessment done. As I recall, the costs for Northern Ireland are slightly higher. The costs are in terms of familiarisation with the legislation, redoing contracts, or perhaps in the first instance designing new contracts. So there's some cost during that period, and the costs for Northern Ireland, I think, are 200,000. That's what they've been estimated at. There is a period now for the sector to adjust. So the regulations will apply to new contracts probably from around late summer, depending on the parliamentary process as they go through. And then it will apply to existing contracts a further 12 months later. So I say that there's that 3 months for the new ones, and then there's the 12 months for, well, an additional 12 months for the existing contracts to be amended. So given that period of time to adjust, I think the costs they're not exorbitant.
No, okay, and I know this is covered in the paper, and sorry for bringing it up because the information is in front of me, except I just want a bit more clarification in regard that there's it says that there will be no direct EU implications from the UK regulations. This sits completely aside from any of the Windsor framework. Or,
yeah, that's completely outside the Windsor
totally
framework. There is
internal.
parallel legislation, obviously, in the EU, and the EU are looking at that at the moment, but this is UK legislation.
And there's no sense. Is there any sense of like even duplication for export purposes or anything like that? Is there any? Is that a?
Do you mean in terms of do the two sets of regulations clash? Or?
Yeah, possibly in terms.
They're very, to be honest, in my view, they're very similar.
Okay.
So if you, when we started out, when the UK started out on this journey of looking at supply chain contracts, we were in the EU and we were looking at the EU legislation. There isn't a great deal of difference between the provisions in the EU and in the UK. And understand the EU's thinking about making contracts mandatory now. There was the provision to make them mandatory before, but they're now considering that it would just be mandatory full stop to have a contract.
Okay, and then again in the paper it says that in terms of the respondents from DAERA, 74% of the sector were agreed that it was something that would be welcome.
In the consultation that happened back in 2022, I think it was, there were issues identified in the relationships between producers and processors, and there was a sense there was a lack of trust and a lack of transparency about what producers were getting for the animals they were producing and selling. This should make it much more transparent, because you will have a contract that sets out you deliver this amount of pigs and this is what you're going to get for them. And any change to that contract then needs to be agreed between producer and processor.
Okay. Okay. I'm content. Members, any other questions that they want to?
Quick question.
Yeah.
Karen, I get the bit about the contract and who gets what they perceive to be fair. That's not my direct responsibility, but the issue around food traceability, I take it there are elements of food traceability to this also then. If contracts are signed on the movement or purchase or sale of animals.
I suppose that would be a kind of side benefit of it, but it's primarily about regulating those relationships to make sure that everybody's clear on what is happening and there's no sudden change that producers are not aware of.
Yeah, okay.
And they're just told, right, next week you're getting such and such instead.
Okay.
Attention.
Yeah.
Happy enough? Members happy?
Happy.
You can content, Declan? Yeah. Piglet. Yep. Okay. Thank you very much, Elaine. Okay. Thank you for your assistance with that. Members, we're going to now take a very short break, just literally for 2 minutes, whilst we just got to come for a break. We're going to have the officials come in shortly. So,
Very good.
Thank you. Here's agenda item 7. We're now going to move into open session again. That's the briefing from the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute, AFBI, here in Hillsborough. Refer you to pages 205 to 222 of the pack, to the AFBI briefing pack on delivering a net zero, nature positive future, supporting sustainable agriculture and a thriving rural community. So members, I welcome the following AFBI officials to brief the committee and answer any questions that you may have. Dr. Stanley McDowell, the Chief Executive, Dr. Alastair Douglas, Director of Veterinary Sciences Division, Professor Elizabeth Magowan, Director of Sustainable Agri-Food Sciences Division, Mrs. Nuala McCaulley, Director of Finance and Corporate Affairs Division, and Mr. Pieter-Jan Schön, you can, if that's okay, second close. Good. Director of Environment and Marine Sciences Division. Thank you so much for sharing your premises with us today, and I'm just going to ask you now to brief the committee. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Good morning, Chair and committee members. Just really like to welcome you here to Hillsborough. Really do appreciate you taking the time out of your diaries to be with us, and hopefully you'll find the visit informative and useful. We've covered quite a bit of background in terms of the briefing we sent through, but I'll maybe pick up on a little bit of the history around this particular site. While AFBI itself is a relatively young organisation set up in 2006, we really have a long, proud history of scientific research and scientific work in Northern Ireland, going back about 100 years. This particular site here at Hillsborough is one of 7 in total, where AFBI is based, dates from the 1800s, transferred to the government in 1925, and then set up as the Agricultural Research Institute of Northern Ireland, with the appointment of trustees in 1926. So while originally set up as an agricultural research institute, The work here today at Hillsborough is very much around the sustainability agenda, looking at many of the environmental challenges that Northern Ireland faces in terms of things like climate change, ammonia, nutrient use efficiency, water quality. And you'll see some really excellent examples of that later on in the tour. As an ALB, our work programme is very much aligned to that of the department, to the priorities of the DAERA Minister and the wider NI Executive. And we do very much welcome the emphasis which Minister Muir has placed on science and the importance of science to the work of the department and the importance of the work which AFBI undertakes to the work of the department. The work programmes that we have within AFBI, they're agreed annually with the department, covering various statutory scientific services through an assigned work programme, and then what's known as the DAERA Directed Research Work Programme on the R&D side. In addition to the funding that we get, the sort of the core grant and aid from the department, AFBI also leverage significant additional non-grant and aid income through externally funded research or other scientific work from a range of funders. At the moment, that's around about 23-24 million per annum is what's expected this year as non-grant and aid funding. In very broad terms, AFBI scientists provide statutory and surveillance science, research and development, emergency response capability, and we provide expert scientific advice into the various DAERA programmes, programme delivery, policy development, evidence needs, etc. As I've mentioned, we've covered a reasonable amount of background, hopefully, in the pre-visit briefing. We've also included on the table sort of corporate copies of our corporate plan, the most recent science impact booklet. But I would like, if I can, just for a few minutes, maybe to pull out some of the key highlights and aspects of the work that we do. Set out in the corporate plan are sort of 5 strategic priorities. 3 of them are around sort of the science aspect that we do, leading improvements in the agri-food industry to enhance its sustainability, the protection of animal, plant and human health, and the reference to human health being in terms of food safety, and the enhancing the natural and marine environment. And to give you some examples of the work that's done in terms of the sustainable agri-food systems, the leading improvements in the agri-food industry to enhance its sustainability, we got a range of work really trying to address the agricultural aspects of the various environmental challenges which NI faces. This includes aspects such as phosphorus balance and water quality and the flow on through to water quality through dietary interventions, things like reducing phosphorus in dairy cow diets. Ammonia strategy, looking at the evaluation of the impact of reducing protein in diets and a range of farm-level interventions to reduce ammonia emissions. Climate change, really broad spectrum of work, looking at climate mitigation, sequestration, adaptation, right from management of our soils through use of multi-species swards with reduced nutrient input requirements. Work to look at enteric methane emissions from livestock, more accurately measure those, and how we maybe have methods to reduce methane emissions through various dietary and other interventions. But also importantly, looking at overall agricultural efficiency. A more efficient industry will reduce nutrient outputs and the impacts on the environment. In terms of protecting animal, plant and human health, some really critical work themes within that. One aspect is anticipating and responding to emerging and transboundary epizootic diseases, things like blue tongue, highly pathogenic avian flu, and a number of we obviously will be aware of the recent cases in Northern Ireland about a month ago or so, and the impact that's had in commercial poultry at the time. As well as preparing for known threats like avian flu, a key aspect of the work of ASD is having the capability to respond to new and emerging pathogens. The last number of decades has shown something like 30 new and emerging pathogens in human and animal populations. COVID-19 was the most classical example of that, causing, as it did, the largest global pandemic for a century, and a very stark reminder of the impact that new and emerging diseases can pose, including those that arise from animal populations. And I'm very proud of the work that AFBI undertook during the pandemic to support the NHS through laboratory testing for COVID-19. Other aspects of the work of ASD include statutory and research work on bovine TB, which I think, as all of us know, is the most difficult and devastating endemic animal disease which NI faces. Work on things like whole genome sequencing to investigate the epidemiology of disease and provide important evidence to inform disease intervention and control policies. Within the theme of enhancing the natural and marine environment, AFBI Science has provided a substantial part of the environmental evidence base in relation to Loch Ness and the algal blooms which occurred over the last 2 summers, and particularly come back to 2023. Ongoing and future AFBI Science will play a vital role in informing the options to manage and commence restoration of the loch. Our marine programme, focused on delivering the science needed for sustainable fisheries and increasingly in the various aspects of the marine environment, including impacts of climate change, is increasingly important. AFBI, as you will also know, central role in delivering the DAERA-funded Soil Nutrient Health Scheme, which is the most comprehensive soil sampling and analysis programme ever undertaken. Work which aims to improve nutrient use efficiency on farm with associated environmental and financial benefits. But it also, as well as the sampling and the testing, importantly, it includes research. It includes the use of very advanced geographical scanning techniques and data analytics to derive things like runoff risk maps and associated catchment sciences research. Many of these impacts of AFBI Science derive from long-term science programmes. Things like our work in bovine TV. I remember when I first went to VSD in 1990, my colleague working on the old gel-based methods for analysing strain typing back, and his role was to set that up. But it's often through those long-term science programmes and the ones we've highlighted that we really get maximum impact from the work that we do. Looking to the future, and I've touched on many of the challenges which NI faces, the challenges around climate change. How do we simultaneously have economic growth while meeting greenhouse gas emission targets? The impact that climate change may have on crops, or will have, on crops and animal diseases. And I think AFBI is really in a unique position to deliver integrated, holistic research on the sustainable management of our land and aquatic ecosystems, and to help protect our terrestrial, freshwater and marine ecosystems through innovative science and providing the evidence needed by the department. I've touched on the risks for new and emerging diseases, and it's vital that we've got the capability and the capacity to respond to those challenges through a One Health approach, integrating transdisciplinary research to protect animal, plant and human health. In terms of food, to state the obvious, we all need to eat. We need to have food that's safe, that's nutritious, contributes to healthy lives, produced under welfare appropriate conditions, but importantly food that's affordable. And that's ultimately what the industry is about. From a science perspective, as well as the challenges in climate change, etc., there's a huge pace of technological and scientific advances. The increased availability and capability of instrumentation, data measurement, advances in the genomics that we're dealing means we can do things that weren't possible, that weren't dreamt of 30 years ago. But that comes with a cost, it needs investment in our systems and our infrastructure. And fully exploiting digitisation or data analytics is crucial to AFBI going forward. So looking to that and on the theme of investment, a key part that we're also going through at the moment is investing in our infrastructure and systems. This is a lovely building we're in here. Not all of our buildings are like this. Many date from the 1960s and 70s. They're reaching end of life. And with DAERA support and funding, we're a significant way through a programme of investment in our IT systems and the state infrastructure. Things like the new research vessel, which is under construction at the moment, Animal Health Sciences building, which is out for tender, and hopefully we will see building on that later on, maybe the end of this year, beginning of next. So I think in summary, I think it is not unreasonable to say that the work that we do here is vital to the agri-food industry and marine institutes, our marine industries, which are important economic drivers in NI and main custodians of our nature. We aim to provide innovations for production efficiency, promote environmental sustainability from soil to sea, and enable the NI agri-food industry to market products nationally and internationally. I hope I've given you a sense of the work that we do. We're an applied science organisation. We're about making a difference out there. And it's about how the science we undertake and the outcomes from it can make a real difference. Whether that's a difference for the individual farmer, for the wider agri-food sector, for the environment, but ultimately for society as a whole. We're publicly funded, predominantly publicly funded, as way of making a difference for NI society through the various work streams that we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that presentation, and thank you for the really good submission that we have now in front of us on our computers and on paper. I could hog this, and I do have a few questions, but I'm deliberately going to try and keep my questions short because there's a lot of interesting material here to look at. So I'm very aware that animal welfare has a role to play in reducing emissions, not just for the sake of animal welfare and good custodians of our livestock, but I'm increasingly aware, certainly through conversations, not scientific analysis because I'm not a scientist, that good animal welfare has a part to play in reducing emissions. Has AFBI been involved with any research, development or innovation in that space?
Certainly animal health is part of production efficiency. Controlling endemic animal disease is really important in terms of reducing emissions. And that can apply in terms of whether it's supporting BVD schemes, which industry-led, or indeed into things like bovine TB. More specifically, and maybe Elizabeth, you'd want to comment around animal welfare and the work. There's a small component of work specifically on animal welfare.
So animal welfare encompasses both the health of the animal as well as the well-being of the animal and a right to a good life. Yes, within the efficiency piece, better animal health and better efficiency does drive lower emissions, but there's actually a potential unintended consequence with regards to driving down emissions, where some of the, if we're driving for a carbon footprint, for example, we're driving for a lower carbon intensity, and indoor house systems, for example, are a lower carbon intensity, but that could have an unintended consequence on animal welfare and certainly perception from the consumer. But we're looking at that, and we've trialled any trials that we do, and we'll see this up the yard whenever we've got the yard, is monitoring animal welfare continuously with regards to behaviours as a result of the interventions that we're using. But I would say there's probably a bigger concern for me from an animal well-being perspective with regards to maybe driving emissions, especially carbon intensity, as opposed to benefits, if I'm being honest. But that's stuff we have to bottom out. We're also, a lot of these interventions sometimes to drive emissions, and there's very novel technologies out there, and we're looking at some of them up the yard. We can't talk very much about them because of their IP protection, but they could have, the social licence to adopt those from an animal welfare perspective is another discussion point that we're in the middle of at the minute, and certainly is a big debate within the animal science community. Okay, maybe pick that one up when I'm outside, if that's okay. I'd say, in the human sense, we are what we eat, which obviously has a big impact on our own health, but also, and I know that's been included in your paper in some ways, I'm going to tilt towards it here, that in terms of that animal feed then, and we were in Mount Stewart a wee while back, and we were talking about the multi-sward component part for it and the role that plays. But it strikes me that whilst it works at Mount Stewart because of the topography and the climate, that Northern Ireland being having the many climate conditions that it has in wet ground, dry ground, hills and so on, is there any work being done in terms of that multi-sport that works in different geographical areas so that it's geographically specific for Northern Ireland, that it works kind of everywhere? Yeah. We have done quite a bit of work on multi-species swards, and multi-species swards, of course, are a spectrum. Clover plus grass could be multi-species swards as well as a 12 mixed species in there. We work closely with our partners in Chuggas in this space as well. We will be starting a DAERA-funded project now shortly on multi-species swards, with that in mind, in that it sometimes works in the west and doesn't work so much in the east. So it is the right plant in the right place at the right time, especially to improve its resilience and persistency in the sward and maximise its ability to mitigate against droughts, as well as reduce any emissions, and it's especially the nitrous oxide emissions that and the multi-species swards play into. So we were in the midst of that, but it's quite an extensive piece of work that's been done to put the right plant in the right place in Northern Ireland. It actually was a really good conversation at Mount Stewart, but it was only when probably we went away and you come out of Mount Stewart and you enjoy the climate there, you realise that Fermanagh is a bit wetter and damper, and Tyrone, everywhere's slightly different. So and there's fantastic innovation in clover breeding, with our colleagues over in Ibers as well, which we're working closely with. So.
Brilliant. Okay, I've got one more question, if that's okay, and then I'm going to move around, and there's lots of interest here. So we have had the fisheries and aquatic aquaculture people to committee a little bit, and they say they would require significant support to grow and thrive. Has AFBI had much engagement with that sector, and could you identify any aspects of your research that may assist the aquaculture sector going forward?
The aquaculture sector in particular?
Yep.
So, I mean, Northern Ireland, in the greater scheme of things, don't have a huge agricultural sector, basically because of the geography and only the 2 sea lochs and obviously just 1 salmon farm because of the exposed coast. But the majority of our aquaculture work focus on shellfish, mussels, oysters in particular, and we have very close working relationship with that industry, particularly in Belfast Lough. But also touching on Lochfoyle and Carlingford, particularly in relation to oysters. So it is something that we are constantly been working on for a lot of years, but also an area of development going forward. We still see some potential for growth.
Excellent. I'm hoping to get a visit to a mussel farm myself at some stage. I'm really interested in it. But this will finish me out, so I'm going to mention the other more dirty word, which is the zebra mussel. And I've been an invasive species. Are AFBI involved in any aspect of the removal, reduction, mitigation in regard to zebra mussels and their impact?
Yeah, so I mean, zebra mussel is one of the headaches in Lough Neagh that will prevent ecological recovery because it has a major impact on the system as a whole. We've done work in terms of monitoring the infestation of the loch, starting in the early 2000s, so from Lough Erne to Lough Neagh, going through that. So that's been ongoing work. In terms of what to do about zebra mussels and going forward, I'm sure the committee will be aware that it's impossible to remove from a system once it's introduced, but you can manage it. And we are currently working with the department in terms of a long-term research platform for Lough Neagh, and the zebra mussel work is part of that, in terms of managing it, try and reduce the impact, because there is bits and pieces that you can do to lessen the effect.
There's no predation for zebra mussels at all, no?
Pardon?
Is there any predation for zebra mussels?
No. Very, very little.
Okay.
But there is, of course, a possibility done in other areas for harvesting it, but it's the wider impact of that.
Yes, no, I get that. Okay, thank you. The unintended consequences. Yes. Thank you so much. Okay, I get hog it, but I'm not going to. Declan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And there's loads of questions I could ask, and commend you on your ongoing work. I suppose what I want to ask for you is the whole issue of carbon benchmarking. Obviously for farmers to understand what they need to do in terms of reducing their carbon footprint, they need to understand where they're currently at. So where is the measurement tool at? Where is it at, and when will there be an agreement on the final calculator, and for farmers to know where they're at and what they need to do?
Yeah. So my understanding is that the tender is closed and submissions have been made with regards to establishing and procuring, if you like, one carbon calculator for Northern Ireland, and that's under the Climate Act's requirements. That is going through, hopefully, its final processes of award. Mm-hmm. I don't think we're privileged to say much more than that.
Yes.
At some stage, hopefully in the not-so-distant future, therefore, we will have an awarded carbon calculator for Northern Ireland. Staff here sit on the steering committee as to what that carbon calculator should or shouldn't do for our farmers. So I think the timeline here is that towards the summer into the autumn, we'll be starting to roll that carbon calculator out across farms. So I don't think it's very far away, and I talk to my colleagues across the UK and they're very envious with regards to Northern Ireland PLC and all farmers being on the one carbon calculator. I think it has huge benefits for us to all speak with one voice and have a common language and a common drive towards that goal of reducing our carbon footprint.
And And I suppose on another topic then, just a second point, Chair, you mentioned in the introduction, Dr. McDowell, about the ammonia strategy. Obviously, this is a big issue, and it's it's having a big impact on the farming community in terms of all cases being dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and farmers not being able to maybe replace, say, like with like, or even replace buildings with more environmentally efficient buildings. So again, where's the ammonia strategy at? When will we be coming up, or is there any assessment of when we'll have like a standardised ammonia action plan here for the north?
I suppose our role is very much on the scientific aspects, the
Yes.
research aspect, rather than the actual strategy itself. Elizabeth, do you want to?
No, well, that's it. It's up to the department. The consultation on the feedback.
Yes.
Funny I have it here.
Yeah.
Is out at the minute, so our research has fed into some of those,
Yes.
the impact of what potentially some of those interventions could have. So hopefully, if that comes out in the next few months and is agreed, it gives us a pathway to at least reduce our ammonia emissions significantly through those known interventions. And we've done the MAC curve work, the economic work
Yes.
against that, to
Yes.
understand how much that could cost as well. So hopefully that helps with a pathway towards reducing ammonia emissions.
And see, I know that most of us will be familiar with the LESE equipment as one of the means for reducing. Is there any what other tactics or other strategies or strategies or mechanisms would be used, for example, on farm to help reduce?
A quick ammonia is created whenever feces and urine mixes.
Yes.
So the initial intervention there is to reduce it mixing in the first place, and their slat designs help with that. Removing it from the house as quickly as possible, shallow tanks into covered stores is your next layer of mitigation. Reducing the protein content of pig, poultry and dairy diets is another one, which actually we've done a lot of research on and is actually quite well adopted within the industry at this moment in time, especially in the pig and poultry world. And then you're further down the pipe is your LESE technologies to reduce it being emitted at application. So the MAC curve work that we've completed, you've got 5 or 6 technologies there, which actually could be sometimes cost benefit to the farmer, but are certainly very low cost to the farmer. Could actually achieve the most of, I think it was 21 kilotons of ammonia reduction for nearly cost neutral or not very much cost. You do get the LESE techniques and above ground storage are your more expensive ones. And you have some really strong technologies coming out of the Netherlands at the minute as well, the Lely sphere techniques, and so you've got really expensive ones that will take us further, but they will involve significant investment.
Yeah, I think we've seen some of them in operation when we were up at the Greenmount visit that day, and I'm not asking you a question. I think it's important to make a comment that this would require capital investment on the farmers' part, and I think it's important that there is capital set aside to support farmers in making that transition. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Declan. John, please.
Thank you, Schön. Thanks to all of you. It's good to see you always, of course. I won't pretend to know the detail of everything that you do, but your presentation and the updates we get on a regular basis gives us some idea of the scale and breadth of the work and the number of issues being covered. So, with that in mind, can I ask, first of all, it's probably a foregone conclusion, this one, but I want some clarity around it, some detail if you can. Issues like the bovine TB work, the Loch Ness work, agri-improvements work in terms of emissions, those are bound to be, whatever timed programme you have now, the overall issue is bound to be a much longer term project. So is that factored into the forward planning, not only in terms of the work involved and how long you're going to be doing it for, but the resources required to do that? Because I'm thinking you could be talking a decade plus for some of this stuff. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I think a lot of the work programmes we have are long term, and that's one of the fundamental reasons why research in the agri-food sphere is often done through an ALB as compared to the university sector, is because of those long-term studies. Our research with the department, as I said, is a DAERA-directed research programme, so that's decided by DAERA policy leads. Those projects are often 3-4 years in term. It certainly is AFBI's view that we need to move to a programme-based approach, which very much looks at the 5 and 10 years. And certainly, much of my background was in bovine TB, it very much needs to be that sort of horizon to really start to make the impacts that we need to.
That's helpful, and particularly in relation to your intention or hope to move to more programme-driven work. Leads me probably directly then to the second question, which is that there's a clear link between the work that would be done by your Environment Marine Sciences Division in terms of the state of our waterways and work being done by Elizabeth and Agri-Science, for example. So in what way is the collaboration done between those divisions to ensure that one piece of work is helping the other?
I think it's one of the sort of key strengths that we have is being able to have those two aspects. It's not an easy thing to balance, the agricultural and environmental aspects of it, but it is a real strength. We've got both environmental scientists and agricultural scientists within the organisation working together on these problems and actually following problems right through from the agricultural waterways and into the marine environment. So that is a real strength they have. But I don't know if colleagues would want to.
And this is where, whilst Pieter-Jan manages EMSD and I manage SFASD, we work as programmes, so soil health, emissions, etc., etc. So, our teams are working together, and we've got AB folk here on site working alongside in offices, taking their tea alongside the agri-sciences as well, and that all helps foster. So it's a one-team approach between the two.
Yeah, very, very quick supplementary, Chair, for me. The phosphorus outputs and levels, for example, are a clear example of work between divisions where the impact on waterways links straight back to where the output begins. So that's been examined in a sort of collaborative way then.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's a really spanning right through from the dietary aspects of phosphorus.
Also,
that's the agricultural aspects, into the water quality, the catchment sciences, and right into the effects of that. And I think it's good because effectively our scientists also reflect the background. It reflects that environmental agriculture and trying to balance those. So we do have those mix of people and scientists coming from different backgrounds and perspectives, which hopefully reflects the challenges that NI is facing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. Michelle, then Patsy.
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much for hosting us today and for your presentation. I'm very positive about the work that AFBI does, and I wish you well in some of your new ventures as well, because I'm mindful of the fact that you've a long-standing relationship with Barenberg, and that's obviously coming to an end. I'm just curious as to what that's going to mean for grass breeding then moving forward.
So within our AFBI science strategy, we are committed to grass breeding. The Barenberg contract was the commercialisation aspect of the strategic investment in grass breeding. DAERA invested in that element of it. I can't say very much, but we have a number of options on the table at the minute in front of us, which are quite positive with regards to us being able to continue that grass breeding work. As I say, this has actually offered a number of options that we can relook at the model of how we do that and funding for that. So we are scoping those at the minute and discussions with DAERA. So as I sit here today, I'm more positive than negative actually around the future of what that could look like, but we are working through what those options are and the pros and cons of them.
Okay. And Stanley, in your presentation you mentioned that you have non-grant income of around £23-24 million per year. Could you maybe give us a bit more information in relation to the type of work that you're doing in order to attract that kind of income?
It spans across, some of that, while it's non-grant aid, comes from the department. So, for example, soil nutrient health scheme, they'll will keep me right if I go wrong in anywhere. The soil nutrient health scheme is coming in around about 8-10 million, so that's part of that. Peace Plus is a very important funding stream for us. We are very successful in the last Interreg series of ones, and we have a number of other projects coming through over the next number of years. Can then go into things like, which again DAERA co-funded in terms of North-South collaboration on the Daphne DAERA project. Some collaborative work in terms of UKRI, BBSRC Institute funded, right on through into commercial services. It's a small amount. We get a little bit of farm income, so there's quite a spectrum within it. But it is predominantly based on public sector funded R&D. That's our main focus of external income.
Okay, and obviously the relationships that you have with the universities are critical and all of that as well.
Yes. A lot of, the agricultural side, really strong collaborations with Queen's, particularly looking at things like nutrient and methane inhibitors. On the environment side, really good collaborations. University of Ulster very strongly involved in aspects of soil nutrient health scheme and catchment scientists. And then outside of those two areas, we'd also have, on the animal health side, UCD, for example, animal health and bovine TB, a long-standing collaboration with the University of Edinburgh under aspects of whole genome sequencing. So we have quite extensive, I don't have figures at my fingertips, but we've got quite an extensive network of collaborations and the non-grant and aid funded work that we do.
Okay. And obviously representing Strangford and Portamogie in particular was my earliest engagement with AFBI was in relation to the science aspect around fish sustainability and stocks and Brussels engagements and so on as well. It's a bit of a love-hate relationship there, I would say. But I suppose topical at the moment would really be the issue of offshore wind and the renewable piece, and perhaps the impact that may have then on fishing opportunities. And I'm just curious about the work that maybe you've done with regards to that.
That marine spatial planning aspects of their, and the impact of, there's a lot of demand on marine resources from various sectors, and this is obviously one of them that's expanding quite a lot. And it's, as you would be aware, that holistic approach that we have in terms of ecosystem-based research, been doing, since the mid-2000s, is helping with identify those trade-offs and risks about different industries coming in and different demands on that resources, and obviously the impact on the fishing industry, because none of these things is straightforward. If you put a wind farm in place, you're displacing effort somewhere else. It might actually make it worse in terms of fish stock management. But there's also benefits from wind farms, in terms of conservation benefits and providing nursery areas for fish. And so it's all about that, societal choice in terms of trade-off and how you want to use the resource. So it's challenging. But there, there's solutions being found everywhere because it's a lot of big wind farming is big in Europe, and it's not as simple as well. You talk about there's some reference to especially cross-border wind farms where the one might affect the other one, and then you start getting into different disputes. But that work is ongoing, and it's always been a critical part of supporting the department in terms of sustainable fishing industry.
Okay, and do you have an update on the new vessel when that will be completed?
Contractually, February 2027, okay. But the shipyard is hoping to have it between September and October 26.
Maybe that might be something that the committee might want to put in its diary then, maybe for a viewing of that. Okay, thank you very much.
Michelle. Patsy.
Yep, thanks very much, and thank you for your work. I'm just browsing through some of it there. Could I just ask you, there's a number of questions. The soil nutrients scheme and soil testing that's going on, many of the farmers that we would know are seeing people out on their ground doing that. Could you maybe just tell us how you see that developing? Well, first of all, a big concern for me would be because I represent the area, like John, I represent an area which is right along the shore of Lough Neagh, and I represent probably the entire western shore of it almost. Could I just ask you how you feel that the soil nutrient scheme could help with some of the problems that are leading to the ecological problems in Lough Neagh? Just leading on from that, also, if you could explain to me that soil nutrient scheme for poultry litter, the poultry litter, and how that may be contributing in some way to higher levels of nitrates in the soil if it's been sprayed. And also, it's been raised with me, in some instances there's grit in that poultry litter, leaving it very difficult to go through what would be the normal methods of disposal. Grit is in it. Well, you know much better than me about shell, the strength of the eggshells and stuff like that. If you could just maybe tell me if there's anything that you're working on there at the moment around that, and then we go to the inevitable, the bovine TB, which has really cost the public purse exorbitant amounts of money in terms of not only veterinary applications but actual cost compensation to farm families, and it just really there has to be some method of stopping or reducing the spread of it. Any input that you have to that, and then finally, if you could tell us the SBRI or Innovate UK or whatever they call it now, any involvement you might have with the Loch Ness initiatives, or indeed any other SBRI initiatives that are in gestation or in completion or whatever you want to call it, through yourselves, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe deal with the soil nutrient health scheme first of all. It is very much around how we optimise nutrient efficiency use on farm. But Pieter-Jan, do you want to come in on the back of that and some of the, it's...
Yeah, in terms of nutrient management, of which Loch Ness is just the example we're talking about at the minute because of the visual bloom, but it's a countrywide issue affecting all our freshwater resources. But Loch Ness, the soil nutrient health scheme, the flagship project that it is we're almost like a step ahead in terms of having done it. And the key part of the soil nutrient health scheme is to help farmers to develop a nutrient management plan for their farms, both in terms of reducing access to, that has an impact on profitability of applying excess of fertilizer, but also in terms of that wider aspect of sustainable farming. So those things will slowly but surely feed through into the nutrient action program, but the critical part is that development of nutrient management plans and the application thereof, and that's the biggest challenge going forward.
Yes,
is that behavioural change that we need to help the farmers with.
Okay.
And obviously the other aspects of the soil nutrient health scheme is the LiDAR data, the 3D topography of the land that helps with nutrient risk runoff maps. That also can inform and help the farmer in terms of where they can focus their effort in terms of reducing that runoff to the waterways.
Just to follow through on that, how do you see the department checking that there is improvements as a result of the scheme at this stage? So if you go now to say that feels bad, phosphate too high, nitrate too high, ammonia, whatever you're doing in that field there, so you have a record of that, and do you envisage that maybe in say 4 or 5 years' time you're back again to check on the lands?
Okay, that's obviously not our area.
If you were to do it, but
if I was to do it. But what I can say to you is in terms of the Loch Ness action plan, I mean, the department has employed more inspectors in terms of water quality, and that making sure that regulations are implemented has been a big conversation around new strategies going forward. But there's a lot more. And then, of course, we are investing into more water quality monitoring and long-term water quality monitoring, including higher resolution monitoring to help with that overall management.
So you don't have an opinion on how you monitor the land then?
That's not up to us.
That's not up to us.
I know it's not up to you, but you're the scientist. So,
Well, I think the soil nutrient health scheme obviously, just as a baseline for Northern Ireland,
yes,
it will identify areas that are high in phosphate in individual farms. So it provides the tools, combined with the risk runoff map,
yes,
provides the tools for individual farmers to try and manage nutrients better. Don't want to duck the question, but ultimately that's with the department as to how they use that information going forward. But you would hope that the use of that information is done collaboratively with farmers. And it's through education to really change behaviours. And there's an important part of soil nutrient health scheme is looking at behavioural aspects. How do we change behaviours on farm? And that's a key part in terms of, you know.
There is an important discussion around land use strategy and land use management, and that's a combination of right plant, right tree in the right place. There is a large range of crops that we haven't even thought about, and again, we're starting some work scientifically on novel crops that perhaps can help with mitigate those runoff areas as well, and that wider land use to deliver both food, fuel, and fibre. You know, so there's a lot of demands, and there's some nice work that we're conducting in this space of land use options, land use strategy going forward.
The other part, poultry litter, Elizabeth, not my expert area.
The grit aspect is a problem, but that's mainly coming from the layer industry. And my understanding is that the poultry litter from layers isn't yet going into the likes of stream energy because of that issue.
That's the problem.
We are, I need my other colleague, my other Elizabeth here, she works very closely with Moy Parks of this world on litter, but they're looking at technologies in that space at the minute. The nitrates, yes, you do have quite a concentrated product coming out of any anaerobic digestion that has a higher nitrogen content, so applying that directly in or injection is important. But again, through some of those SBRI initiatives, you know, there's some really nice ideas there, and business and industry is very much driving potential supply chains for that material to go where it's needed, either locally, nationally or internationally. So I think there's some really interesting, exciting work happening under those SBRIs, especially at the minute.
And just on that, do you have an involvement with those SBRI initiatives, or what ones are live or pending that you can share with us?
We have, because it's focused on SMEs, you know, we have a very low-key involvement in some projects. But I suppose a bigger part thereof is that we are, you know, some of our staff is part of the review panels for proposals and outcomes, and as the progress progresses. So that's the main part.
We will also be starting a piece of work shortly on modelling the impact of the sustainable utilisation of livestock slurry SBR project on ammonia emissions in particular. So that's a DAERA piece of work to help inform, you know, DAERA around the impacts and try to mitigate them accordingly.
In terms of, I'll take the bovine TB one, you know, the work that AFBI does spans from testing in terms of reactors getting into the abattoir, significant piece of work there, badge RTAs, and it's through things like badge RTAs that we actually have any information on gamma interferon in the blood test, and it's not an easy test. It's done through Veterinary Sciences Division. The research that's been done on AFBI has been various aspects to it, but a key aspect has been understanding the molecular, you know, some of the many techniques around the molecular strain types. Talked about TB. Much of that was done from fundamental principles at VSD and now into what's known as whole genome sequencing. And the whole sort of Badger story, you come back to the 1970s, it was only then that, you know, it was known that badgers were involved, and now we've got to the stage where through the various techniques we can say they have the same strains, occur in the same locality, right through into whole genome sequencing. That's been a huge focus of the R&D, is about understanding those molecular changes and how what that can tell us about the epidemic, you know, the localization of it. Other aspects of the work at VSD has been around the immunology and the blood test. Some of the information around the gamma interferon is from work that was done at BSD. So that's been key.
I'm going to have to jump in. Just have to jump in. Is okay?
No, thank you. That's been very useful.
We've two other members have indicated at the moment, and probably got about 15 minutes max, guys, if that's okay. Absolute max. So, William, you're next, and then Aoife.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and can I thank you for the work you do. Also, I think science and research is more important than ever, given where the industry is and given emissions and global warming and climate change targets that we have to try and meet, which I very much doubt we'll be able to do, but that's another issue. A couple of questions, and a number of my questions have already been taken, but on the issue of TB, which you mentioned earlier, I know there's trials in the UK mainland on a vaccine. Are you aware of this, and what's your view on possible vaccine in the future?
The work has been done. It's been led by APHA. We're not directly involved in those trials around cattle vaccine. I think it's been predominantly done in Africa. The key challenge around cattle vaccination is the ability. Well, one is a trade issue in terms of ability to trade, but importantly in terms of tests, it would interfere effectively with the current skin test. So there's been a lot of work looking at differential tests in England to be able to differentiate between vaccinated animals and skin tests.
Okay.
A personal opinion, I remain cautious. The skin test in itself is good specificity. Animal sensitivity is moderate, and I think the complication of vaccination, I hope that will get resolved, but I must remain in the cautious camp because of the interference with the skin test and the need to move to a differential skin test.
Yeah, well, I'm a farmer myself, so I clearly understand. We have the same skin tests as we had probably in the 50s, 60, 70 years ago. We don't seem to have moved forward in that. It's only 70 or 80% reliable. So there is an issue there for the future to try and get something that's better.
You're absolutely right, and I think it does need to be an ongoing focus of research around. TB is a problematic disease. It's a problem not just in cattle but also in human populations. But you're absolutely right. Effectively, the skin test is the same skin test that was developed 100 years ago. There's been some developments. Gamma interferon, was developed, but that was again about 30 years ago. Gamma interferon we know is a more sensitive test, but is less specific. So we'll pull out a lot more false positives. It's a more expensive test, so that limits its use. But you're absolutely right. There's a need to constantly look at alternative testing techniques in terms of TB. And there's been many things proposed. There are some that have a little bit of evidence, but many tests have been proposed that have not stood up to the test of time in terms of alternatives. It's not an easy space to be in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Aoife?
Thanks. Yeah, look, thanks so much for the presentation and all your answers so far. I learn something new every time I come to these meetings. But just going off Patsy's points about the soil sampling scheme, having spoken to locals in relation to the scheme, they have said to me that they find it very hard to interpret the sample results. And is there any plans in place to make that a bit more user-friendly?
Yeah, obviously, CAFRE is heavily involved in terms of that sort of education piece. Pieter-Jan, do you want to maybe expand a bit more on that?
Yeah, the training aspects is obviously done through CAFRE, and the material that's developed around that is also their responsibility. But it's an ongoing issue for us, in terms of training take-up and actual getting farmers to view the results and start the conversation. But there is a lot more to be done to support farmers in terms of that transition towards sustainable practices and nutrient management. There's a recognition of that, both with ourselves and within the department. So it's something for future.
Good, yeah. I've looked at it myself, and it is fairly complex whenever you're looking at it. And just a second question, just how do hill farms balance livestock farming and environmental conservation, and what benefits does this integration offer to local ecosystems and farming communities?
Maybe Elizabeth, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we have admittedly done a lot more work on lowland farming systems, but we have done a little bit of work on hill farming systems, and certainly there is a synergy between a number of hardier breeds in the hills, both on a sheep and beef perspective, with the wider ecosystem. So there is definitely strong evidence there that the two can work in harmony and actually are needed to be synergistic within that space. But there's a lot more work to be done in that. There's a lot more work to be done with regards to quantifying the actual impact of animals in the hills on the ecosystems that are up there, and vice versa. So I suppose it is a space that we have a little bit of knowledge in, and we've done some nice behavioural work on the animals and how they interact with their ecosystems, but it is a space that actually needs a lot more attention, I would suggest, especially around the economic quantification of all of that.
Thank you.
Are you okay with that?
Yeah, perfect.
Any members, any other questions? Yep. Could I just ask one then, just a very, just it was on my list, so we've got a couple of minutes. It's just on sheep scab. I don't know, because you mentioned blue tongue, TB and all different things. Are AFBI involved in any current trials or different approaches to sheep scab? I'm aware that it's...
Yeah,
there's
a little bit of AFBI involvement. It's been predominantly through a UKRI project with economics involvement in that one.
Mm-hmm. Correct, and that just coming back through the final cabinet. It was with Harper Adams, ourselves, and it was, I think, from memory now, you're really testing me, but from memory it was nearly about farmers' attitudes to try to manage it, as well as trying to put an economic quantification on it to help raise the awareness of the importance of identification of it. The testing methods for sheep scab are pretty robust, from a veterinary perspective, and how to intervene with it. I think it was more that behavioural aspect was the research gap.
No problem. Okay, listen, guys, thank you so much for your presentation and for taking the questions of the members. You can see you're very interested, and many of us would want to keep you here for longer, but unfortunately time constraints will dictate otherwise. So thank you so much, and we look forward to, at the end of the committee meeting, then spending some more time with you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Members, just before we do move on to the next agenda item, can I refer you to an email that you will have received with regard to a press release based on our visit to AFBI today, and if you are content that the press release is to your liking, then we can give permission for that to be shared at the end of the meeting. Is that okay?
Okay with you, Chair. It's okay with us.
my name's all over it. That's what it is, yes. Thank you. Thank you, members. Okay. Thank you.
Can I give you a few instructions just with regards to the tour? Sorry.
Yes, of course.
You will need to suit and boot.
Okay.
So we'll give you your suits and your boots here and your flares and jackets. We'll be going out through this door then onto the transporter, and the transporter will take you up. So it's the usual safety things, just to be cautious and do what you're told. If that's okay. So as I say, we'll bring in your suits and boots now shortly, and if you can, and the time it is for 20 past to leave here, if that's okay.
We're down for 12:30. If that's okay.
That's fine.
It's 12:30. Okay.
No problem. No problem. We'll come back in half.
Thank you so much. All right. Okay, guys. We are going to turn to agenda item 9. That is the Research and Information Service raised briefing on community asset transfer. I'm going to refer you to pages 255 to 270 for the raised paper. As you'll recall, following the briefing from the Development Trust NI at our meeting on the 30th of January, we agreed further research was required in this matter and commissioned a research paper from RAISE. It was also agreed that following consideration of the paper, the committee would then consider whether a future committee motion calling for debate would be useful or not. So I'm going to welcome Mark Allen from Research Office to brief us on the piece of research. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members. And look, I'm aware you're on the clock, so I'll try and be as brief as I can. And I suppose the paper is in pages 255 to 270 of your pack. And I suppose the rationale really, as you alluded to, Chair, was the Commission came about through the Rural Assets report that you'd been presented by DTNI. So I suppose what I had looked at, was to try and summarise existing supports for community asset transfer across the UK and Ireland, and then to maybe look at more specifically at some of the rural dimensions of that, both maybe current and looking to the future. So in terms, just very quickly again, just to what is community asset transfer, and I suppose that the definition, the best I could find, is that it's a process that allows a community organisation to take publicly owned land or buildings, to take those over in a way that recognises the public benefits that the transfer will bring. And I suppose this is it's a process which is worldwide, but it's quite widespread even within the UK. DTNI, as the Chair alluded to, are actually making specific requests at this point in time for dedicated funding, a £70 million Northern Ireland Community Ownership Fund is one of their actual key asks to enable this process to happen. And as well, they've asked for the actual adoption and development of specific legislation, a so-called Community Rights and Empowerment Bill. And I suppose that really, in their aspiration, would both provide a means for people to buy, our communities to buy and secure ownership of local assets, to own those and to manage them and develop them in a way that's really for local benefit, because that's, I suppose, one of the emphasis here is the local community are best placed to know what they require and what solutions might be. So without really dwelling too much, you can see there on pages 257 onwards, I've really tried to provide you an overview of both the legislation in terms that enables this process to happen across all the jurisdictions. I've explained what the main provisions are within that legislation. I've also looked at and provided that for you, and all those links are live, so I would encourage you to, if you want to read more, they're there. It took a while to find, I have to be honest, because there's quite a few roads we had to go into to gather. There's also their information around non-legislative provision and guidance, because that's one of the things that was very noticeable when you looked at this. There is quite a range of guidance that's been produced by government departments and others, such as Development Trust, to support communities through their process. I've also included, which is one of the key factors in this, and I'll come back to this, is existing financial support and how it relates and what is available, because obviously there are costs to communities. Regardless of what a community manages to secure a potential asset for, there are associated costs in doing that, and I suppose, as even DTNI themselves alluded to, there are ongoing costs. So it's not simply a one-off cost. For a community to continue to run a facility or to utilise land, there are ongoing costs. And finally, then I just looked at, I suppose, as I said, some of the actual rural-specific supports, both in terms of finance and maybe in terms of non-financial or technical support, both where things are at present, and maybe ask some questions for where things possibly could go or need to go. So just then, in terms of just on page 269, I'm just going to summarise some of the observations. As the Chair did allude to, we don't currently have a specific dedicated community asset transfer piece of legislation here. But I have to say that that process is both theoretically and practically possible under existing legislation. And we do have, you had even the day they appeared, the Cushendall Innovation Centre highlights this can be done within the legislative framework that we currently have. We're also not unique in Northern Ireland in not having dedicated community asset transfer legislation. The same challenge exists both down south and across in Wales. England has the 2011 Localism Act, which has some powers, but they're not as extensive as those in Scotland. So I suppose the summary of that is this process can happen in all 5 jurisdictions and does appear to be utilised to varying degrees of success or even interest. Scotland probably is unique, really specifically to Part 5 of the Community Empowerment Scotland Act of 2015, which gives community bodies basically the right to request to purchase, lease, manage or use land and buildings belonging to local authorities, certain Scottish public bodies or even the Scottish ministers. What's unique about that is that the relevant authority is effectively prohibited from selling the asset until it considers the community body request. So a community body's request can't be simply dismissed on the fact of it's not the same financial value. There are non-financial benefits, for example, to a number of these transactions. So the ministers or the public body in Scotland are required to consider those in the round. And I think they have to rule out why community asset transfer isn't possible. So in a sense, the community is sitting in a better position. They're not competing equally. They're competing on the basis that their proposal effectively has to be knocked out. So I think that's quite unique. Practical support and guidance across the 4 UK jurisdictions, I have to say, is broadly comparable. And that's highlighted in the table. There is practical support down south, but one of the things that was interesting is the community asset transfer terminology and language isn't as widely utilised within that jurisdiction, but there are very clearly equivalent activities and actions and guidance. Funding, I think this is one of the big points, is the fact that the funding provisions in the UK for community asset transfer are more challenging than they were. And in effect, the big challenge there was the loss of the Community Ownership Fund, which had been developed under the previous UK government, really part of the levelling up. That has gone, and there are other available options, but it's predominantly lottery focused. Scotland is unique, I suppose, within the islands of having a dedicated land fund. And that, I suppose, is funded by the Scottish Government to the tune of £10 million a year. The proposal was to increase it to 20 million. I'm not quite sure on the status of that, but that's solely supported by the Scottish Government. In terms of rural-specific dimensions, those were harder to determine, but I think there are suggestions that the process may well have been utilised in rural community development activity across the UK and Ireland on an individual project basis. As to whether it's been promoted collectively, I have more questions, but there are undoubtedly, I think, individual projects. Part of the challenge in this is trying to find where those are, because the database, for example, of rural development projects, you have the name and you have the amount, but you don't have all of the processes contained within it or what actually occurred. And I suppose that's a key question really remains around how future rural community development policies across the UK and Ireland will or can support community asset transfer. I mean, I think even in our own context, for example, our rural policy framework, will community asset transfer feature within that, or will it feature prominently? I suppose I just want to finish then in terms of, as well, by saying around it where things are at. I suppose there are questions, I think, for yourselves as the DAERA committee and for DAERA as a department in terms of where does this sit within your own work stream. I suppose that the Communities Minister, Gordon Lyons, does appear to be taking the lead in this, because he has, for example, given a commitment recently to evaluate the impact of community asset transfer in Northern Ireland. And that's a piece of work that he's intending to commission within this year and next year. And that's going to examine the impact and effectiveness of community asset transfer processes and make recommendations to inform the future delivery of what is now an executive policy. So a key question there is that now the Department of Communities' sole purview? Does DAERA have a role? If there is a role, what is that role? Is it, for example, maybe in dedicated rural funding, or is there, as I said, some specific element maybe of a future rural policy framework which might either target or encourage or support this activity? That's a very much a whistle-stop tour, so happy to take any questions. But as I say, the links are all there. You can look at the information at your leisure, so thank you.
Thank you for that, Mark. Maybe there's a couple of questions that I have. I'll try and get through them as quickly as possible, guys, because they did deal with correspondence, and we can, Mark, I'm sure you'll come back to us. Yes. That's right. So we know that the Development Trust and I are asking the Executive to bring forward a Community Rights and Empowerment Bill. But in your research, you also... how far do you feel that the lack of legislation is the main problem in Northern Ireland, or is it that there's a lack of awareness in regard to the legislation that you've outlined in your findings in the research, and where would be a good place to start? I
think, Chair, without seeing what a bill would contain, it's quite hard to make an assessment. I think, as I said, what is apparent is that processes have been utilised. As to whether, if you ask people who've gone through those, could it have been easier? That's maybe a starting point. And I'm assuming, for example, Department for Communities Review undoubtedly you would expect would include some engagement with people who've utilised it. So I can't really say that, and definitively, would it make the process easier? Is the process widely utilised? Very hard to say. I think it's explored. There are examples. But I think one of the challenges I had was trying to find a place where all of those examples were held centrally. And that might be a question for you as a committee, maybe to, for example, the Rural Development Programme. How many of successfully funded projects, for example, through LEADER, were either encouraged to or availed of or sought to utilise community asset transfer processes? The funding one, I think, when I looked at it, is a massive issue, because I said this costs money. We're all aware of the challenges that the third sector organisations face. Funding streams have changed and are changing. So dedicated resource to enable the activity is probably something that I think any government or any committee or any community would be keen to try and see what the actual thoughts are and what the processes are going forward.
Just anecdotally, Mark, I had a meeting with, I think it's the heritage part of the National Lottery, so it's the funding mechanism, and this certainly very much seems to be, in terms of where they're seeking to utilise their funding, this seems to be almost a direct fit and hit for that.
And I think one of the difficulties there, as I alluded to, whereas the Scottish Land Fund is dedicated to this activity, in any other part of the UK you can apply for lottery funding, but you're competing against other lottery projects. So it's not a dedicated funding stream for that specific element. I suppose when you look down south, I did allude to it in the paper, there are, for example, there's the Town and Village Renewal Scheme, which operates in Ireland. as part of their new rural development programme and their rural action or their rural vision. That's a very specific funding stream which has specific elements, again, which you could apply. So I suppose the question really becomes, do you want to have a general mechanism you can access, or do you want a very, very particular focus in funding and in terms of support, and what benefit would that be in Northern Ireland? Because that at the minute doesn't...
No, I get that. And you just alluded to this because I'm very aware that at a very short period of time spent as a councillor in Lisburn and Castlereagh, that in terms of their asset transfer, it happens. But,
yes.
But we don't have a central database, I suspect, from any of our agencies or local government to quantify what we already do. And I think it'd be unfair to suggest, I know nobody's suggesting that it doesn't happen, but there are already mechanisms, there are already processes, but we don't collate everything that we do.
I think that's definitely. I mean, there is, for example, and the link is in there. You can see what assets are available at this point in time. I was actually quite surprised by the fact that there wasn't an extensive list.
Yeah.
It's quite a limited list. But in terms of successfully funded projects who've used it, I've really struggled within the time frame that we had to do it to actually find that. And as I said, DAERA, for example, in the later stuff, may be able to drill down and tell you, look, how many people have availed, might be able to establish what the need or demand is.
Brilliant.
As well.
Declan?
Thank you, Chair. And this is a topic which is very close to my own heart because I've been heavily involved in projects like this locally in my own community, and indeed John will know as well from my own area, where we took a natural asset, the lake in our village, and it has just become the hub of sport and water sport and fishing and running and everything. And we just recently then took ownership of a disused playing area, 8 acres, and we were one of the few areas that were actually successful to the British Government's Community Ownership Fund. But I have to say that, taking public ownership of those assets, I can't express how beneficial it has been to the wider community. And it's, I'll even give a wee plug that we're even getting parkrun coming to my community now in McCrory and starting in May. So, but the point, I can identify with everything you said. I think there's a number of issues here which I'd be grateful if the committee could maybe put a wee spotlight on as well. You know, as DFC or DAERA, you know, DFC tell us we don't do regeneration funding for settlements under 5,000. You know, whereas then DAERA we don't have a rural development programme anymore, EU rural development programme anymore, for example. So that's an issue. We don't have. I know the department's working on a rural framework, so we need to get that rural framework sorted out. And also, I really do think we should be definitely looking at carving out some money, just like Scotland has for that land fund. So I do think that things are a bit patchy, and I think it's rural communities really, you know, it sort of it minimises their opportunity to be the best that they can be, you know. So Mark, I really have no question. I suppose what I'm saying is, you know, like are you aware of the community ownership fund as a replacement to it? And I will say from my own experience, it was great that our community benefited from that, but it was all done over the heads of the local councils and the executive here. It was just like you had to go directly to Westminster for it, over the head of everything, you know, what we have here, our own devolved structures, which I felt was a bit...
Yeah, look, and that is a theme that I have touched upon in a number of other papers on different topics, and there was criticism around the UK Shared Prosperity Fund and the fact that it was administered in London. Yeah. Local involvement was maybe hard to determine, and I suppose that the community asset transfer process is very much a bottom-up process. It kind of runs counter to a very local to having to apply to a very centralised fund. So, like, I think I highlighted, I suppose, Minister Lyon's commitment to review. I suppose one of the questions there is that with a view to review to have localised funding or localised support. I mean, it is an executive priority, we're told, so that would suggest maybe there is something there, but I think that's something maybe to keep an eye on. But, I think there's the case studies that you read in the DTNI report highlights again the value. I don't think there's any you know, there's no debate on that. The impact of these projects on the communities that they're based is verifiable. So it may well be a process that we want to see prosper, but it's going to require support to do so, I think, is the observation I would make.
Thank you, Mark. JB, small one.
Observation, but before I get on a comment that I have seen the results, and probably not even the most up-to-date result on the scheme that Declan referred to in his area, and the benefits are huge. and probably there's still more potential, as he said. But look, the observation I'm going to make is this: I probably more comfortable if I knew where this was going to sit with DFC or DOF. I can totally understand that DAERA will be identified and related to rural schemes. However, we'd all have to accept that DAERA would have no role whatsoever in an education building or a council building being transferred in an urban area. I mean, there would have to be a central coordination of this, and DFC or DOF are probably the two obvious places for that to be, with DAERA perhaps supporting rural proposals, practically at least. It's wait and see, but it would be good to see some clarification of this soon, so that our rural communities know that there's hope to pursue this in their areas.
Totally agree. We could perhaps, I think we will return to this as a committee, if that's okay. I'm probably going to suggest maybe DFC, I think, again, is probably the ideal place for this to be collated, but we have our rural aspect, which is incredibly important to this committee. Very quickly, Patsy?
No, it's just picking up what John said. I'm wondering, the way we sort of is, at times we talk about departments being in silos and sometimes maybe even committees. I'm wondering, has the Communities Committee, have they picked up on something like this, or worthwhile maybe sending it over to them to draw to their attention?
I think we could do that. I think we could write to the committees and probably finance as well, just to see if it has come across their portfolios and to alert them of this piece of work as much as anything too. I mean, it would be a great paper for them to be aware of that has been commissioned, and I think this committee will return to it. So we'll commission both those letters in the first instance, guys, and if any member wants to, we'll look at this in their forward work plan in terms of prioritisation. Thank you, Mark. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members.
Good. Okay, thank you, guys. So we are. I'm going to race through the next bit, guys, if that's okay. I'm going to ask you: are you content to note correspondence, which is agenda item 10?
Yeah.
Any issues you have with that correspondence, please through myself or the clerk, bring it up at the next meeting. Agenda item 11 is the forward work plan. Do you agree that the forward work plan is published? It's on pages 68 to 71 of your papers. Thank you, members. And then just need to get these both. Copy of the clerk's summary of the committee planning session held on the 13th of March, pages 282 to 285 of the PowerPoint. Two matters I wish to highlight today. Firstly, members, I would ask you to confirm that you're content that the committee team now plans the two-day Fermanagh visit and meeting for Wednesday the 4th. Thursday the 5th of June brings forward a proposed plan based around the listed items in the table as soon as possible to the committee for discussion and agreement, so that business can be prepared. I've spoke to the clerk about this. It is going to be a very, very busy, intense couple of days. We will get incredible value out of you. It's also come to the clerk's attention that the Economy Committee are visiting NSERC on Wednesday the 4th of June. It seems sensible to join with that visit and then carry on with our own agenda. Okay. Secondly, members, regarding the Balmoral Show, the committee team is meeting with the Assembly engagement tomorrow to make further plans. However, we do need to agree to the evidence sessions that we may take on the day. 2 will be sufficient, as we will then be taking part in a post-meeting engagement with committee agreement. I think we had a proposal here from the Young Farmers Clubs and also an update from the UFU at the meeting. Our members agreed on those 2 briefings for the Balmoral Show. Thank you, members. Our members agreed that we take part in the engagement event after the meeting and Balmoral Show to ensure we get and give best value. Thank you, members. Is there any other business? Is that a or a no? Great, thank you. Okay, the date and time of the next meeting, members, is Thursday the 3rd of April 2025 in Parliament Buildings at 10 a.m. The meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.